Hi, my name is Amanda Fletcher, and I am doing my midterm project on the 1951 animated adaptation of Alice in Wonderland. Now, Alice in Wonderland was originally a book written in 1856 by a British author named Charles Dodgson, or aka Lewis Carroll. Now, our book starts out, particularly the setting, in Britain in the 17th-18th century. And we start the film off learning about Alice and her sister and how Alice is struggling kind of to be more mature, like her older sister. And as we watch Alice and her sister interact, Alice eventually falls asleep under this tree they're in. Well, Alice eventually wakes up, or we assume she wakes up, and sees this white rabbit that's standing on 2 feet looking at a watch. So Alice's curiosity, she ends up following this rabbit and they fall down a hole. When they're traveling down this hole, the white rabbit runs off and Alice is left in this world where she doesn't know. And this world makes no sense to her. So as the story progresses, we see Alice is faced with 3 different major trials within the film. Alice has to figure out how to get through a small door. Alice has to unshrink herself being stuck in a house. And eventually Alice has to face the anger of a queen and to make sure she does not get herself beheaded. Now, while she's going through each of these trials, she meets very unique characters. Some of the characters and the more famous characters that she meets is the Mad Hatter, the smoking caterpillar, the Cheshire Cat, his famous grin, the White Rabbit himself, and eventually the Mad Queen, or famous Queen, the Queen of Hearts. Now, the reason why I'm bringing all this up is because it's very important to the conversation later on, especially the 3 trials and some of the characters. Now, while Alice is going through this, one major detail that needs to be brought up is that a lot of, especially these 5 characters, but a lot of these characters ask Alice who she is. And so Alice eventually, because of all these questioning and she's confused as is, loses her identity. And we watch her as she goes downhill and she loses it, but yet gradually she gains more confidence in who she is until she finally finds out who she is. And so the story is really based on a child in her era learning who she is, trying to find her identity, and in a way struggling to stay who she is without conforming to her society's views. And so again, this is what I'm doing my story on. I believe that Alice in Wonderland, especially in 1951's film, was based on the idea that this is a child trying to find her identity and eventually finding it. And this would correspond with America's time frame too. Because in the 1950s, a lot of people, and I've researched it a little bit, but they cited that in the 1950s, America was just getting over several wars, and we were still kind of going through one. And we were facing basically a rebellion of our own state of mind, and especially women at that time when you think about it, because at this time period in 1950s, women were beginning to step out of that square box that society had put us in. And that was basically that we were supposed to stay at home, be mothers. We couldn't really have a good job. We couldn't be ourselves. And in this time period, there was a lot of change happening. So I think Disney kind of based their idea of doing this film, especially taking this type of film and this book, and making it into this, because it was a standpoint where young girls especially could find out that they can find who they are, and they could be that person, period, of what happens in their life, which Disney is really good about basing their stuff on. Believing in yourself, staying true to yourself, and continuing on in your journey. But getting back to the conversation. Now, earlier I mentioned 3 trials, and these are important now. The first trial is when Alice is faced with a small door. But the problem is Alice is too big. She can't get through the small door. So Alice has to try to figure out how to shrink. Well, Alice doesn't really figure it out. In the film, she ends up getting thirsty, ends up drinking a bottle that says "drink me," and believes that it would solve all her issues, or at least take her home. And it doesn't take her home. It makes her shrink, but then she discovers she left the key to, say, a door on the table. Well, now she has to figure out how to get big again and get the key. Well, along the way, Alice ends up getting bigger, but she grows too tall. And now she's a giant compared to the small door. And that's because she ate some cookies. Just telling you, don't eat or drink anything that says eat and drink me, especially if you don't know where it's at or who put it there. So, as Alice is faced with this, she begins to cry, and she eventually makes an ocean of tears that helps float her through this door. Well, getting to the point, though, of this story, the fact in this part is that Alice is still a child. Alice is unable to deal with her frustrations, and which brings her to tears. She could not simply sit there and come to the idea of who she is, and so she has to face the idea that she just can't do it, and this is what causes her to cry. This is where I'm getting at, is that the first trial is showing that Alice is a child, and she really doesn't know who she is or what she's doing. This is why she's crying frustration of tears. So as we go on in our journey and she's faced again and again with these questions, Alice eventually comes to her second trial in the movie. And in the movie, this is when she is mistaken by the White Rabbit as his maid and sent off to get his gloves. So Alice runs, gets these gloves, and eventually Alice comes across these famous little cookies that say, "Eat me." And again, not learning from her first mistake, Alice ends up growing to the point where she cannot fit in this house. She becomes a giant. And she gets stuck within this house. And her arms and legs are out these windows. So now we see a struggling Alice. But the difference is, in this part, Alice becomes more confident in herself. I think this is at that point in the movie where Alice begins to see that she can be who she is and still get through life. Alice eventually figures out that she can put her hands and her legs out the window before she gets squished within this house. And it shows that within the film when it's shooting out. Disney did really well with this direction of it. They used different colors and bright colors. But they did really well by showing two minor characters that I would assume that would have been left out. There's a lizard and the White Rabbit that eventually comes back. And it shows them trying to basically destroy Alice because they think she's like this giant that's trying to take over the world. Well, Alice eventually shoos them away and grows small again and leaves. So as she, in this part, she figured out a way to get through it. She solved her problem. And this is a point in time when Alice is realizing that she can be herself. Like I stated earlier, she can be herself and still grow into a proper young lady. But as we see her go on, Alice begins to see that she doesn't really want to conform to society's standpoint. And so at one point she meets the blue caterpillar again, because previously she's met him only once. And he's again questioning her, so this is the not Alice, or the wannabe Alice. And she basically states, okay, I am Alice. And she confirms it more. And at this point in time, the caterpillar is coming out of his cocoon. He has fully grown into a butterfly. Now, the blue caterpillar, I believe, is a metaphor for Alice's growth into herself, into an adult or a young, older child. And once he has bloomed, I believe Alice has become fully confident that she is Alice. She is who she needs to be. And so this young lady, Alice, eventually goes off to her third and final challenge. And that is Alice eventually meets the Red Queen, or the Queen of Hearts. And Alice is basically makes her mad, and the queen wants her head. And so Alice runs around within the film, and she has to solve this issue of trying to escape this queen. And so Alice does. Alice ends up fighting back the queen and all her guards, and they run on this cute little goose chase, but Alice eventually solves her own issue. This is the first true issue I believe Alice solved on her own, rather than complaining and constantly questioning that she does throughout the film. Alice is a real good questioner, but at the final end, we don't see that Alice questions. Alice is confident in herself, and so her sentences become more statements, and she's very confident in it. And once she reaches that end point and escapes or wakes up, Alice has changed, and Alice has become an adult. And so this film really illustrates that a child within a certain box or society can eventually lose their identity under that pressure. But we see where Alice, instead of under and losing herself within that box that her society put her on, we see her grow gradually into herself and learn to conform into who she is. And I think the end statement to this project is that Disney used this book in a way, and they used it at a good time period, to show young men and women, not just young girls, but society doesn't have to bring them down, but they have to be confident in themselves so that they can bring their society up. They have to be leaders of the future. And again, you have to look at the age groups they were doing. This was 1951 when the movie was created, so kids could have been 12, even younger than that. 20 years later, the 1970s, we are looking at the age of youth. And as one of our classmates put it, the hippie era of love, peace, and change. It was an era of change. So this movie could potentially have sparked many of that younger era to keep confident in themselves, to eventually want to be that change. And so again, I think this movie is particularly a spark into the eras that we are now, because it is a good movie about a child becoming an adult and staying herself along the way and finding herself. But also along the way, it could have been, and this is a good question for myself, which I'm going to do more research on now, was this movie potentially what sparked a lot of the young people of the 1970s to basically want change, not for just, different races, but also for equality within sexes, and to eventually want to make sure that there was equality within everything else. So again, thank you for listening to my very long video about how I believe Alice in Wonderland is a good film of growth within a child of becoming an adult, but also how it actually kind of may have conformed the 1970s era. So again, thank you, and have a good day.